I stood frozen in my emerald bridesmaid dress, the string quartet playing softly over the chatter of my sister's perfect reception. The champagne glass hadn't even touched my lips when Michael's hand gripped my wrist. "We have to leave. Now," he whispered, his eyes locked on the head table. I didn't argue. The drive home was a terrifying, suffocating silence, the kind that exists right before a demolition. Have you ever trusted someone with your life, only to find out they put it in danger? Share your story in the comments. I'm reading every single one. The silence broke the moment Michael locked my front door. He didn't offer me a glass of water or a comforting hug. He gave me a situation report. Michael analyzes threats for a living, and tonight, the threat was my own flesh and blood. Natalie pulled the catering manager aside right before the toasts, he stated, his voice clinical, devoid of panic. She specifically pointed to you, then handed him a bottle of reserve Pinot Noir. I watched the pour. The viscosity was off. There was a cloudy residue near the rim of your crystal glass. It wasn't a bad vintage, Evelyn. It was spiked. I didn't panic. I didn't gasp. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply set down my clutch and looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. My sister, the beautiful bride, had just tried to poison me at her own wedding. It was a calculated execution, disguised as a celebratory toast. She wanted you incapacitated. Or worse, Michael continued, pacing the length of my living room. The dosage in that glass was lethal enough to ensure you wouldn't be walking out of that venue on your own 2 feet. I listened to his assessment, absorbing the data, without letting the emotion hijack my logic. My mind began to catalog every interaction with Natalie over the past 6 months, every overly sweet smile, every sudden inquiry about my health and my business. It had all been reconnaissance. She had been mapping my routines, identifying my vulnerabilities, and planning this precise moment. To understand how a sister becomes a predator, you have to look at the architecture of our childhood. This brings us to the trap of cruel normalization. When you grow up in a house where malice is treated as a personality quirk, you lose your threat detection. My parents never disciplined Natalie for her cruelty. They rebranded it. Her vicious remarks were just Natalie being assertive. Her tendency to take what was mine was just Natalie being competitive. They normalized her toxicity until the baseline of our family dynamic was entirely warped. Because I expected her to be mean, I failed to anticipate her becoming lethal. I realized then that monsters aren't born in the shadows. They are bred at the dinner table, shielded by parents who refuse to hold them accountable. Natalie hadn't snapped. She was simply executing the final phase of a lifelong entitlement I had been conditioned to accept. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for the sister I was about to destroy, but there was only clarity. I had spent 30 years making excuses for a woman who viewed my existence as a competitive inconvenience. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and Natalie's account was severely overdrawn. I was no longer the forgiving sister. The normalization of her cruelty ended tonight. I had spent my 20s drafting blueprints and pouring concrete, building a highly successful architectural firm from nothing. I loved the logic of structures, the predictability of load-bearing walls. Human relationships, specifically with my family, were far less structurally sound. Natalie was a real estate developer, a career built entirely on selling facades. Our father funded her initial investments, praising her ambition while ignoring the trail of burned bridges she left behind. I had always been the silent investor in their version of family. When Natalie needed capital, I drafted free designs for her projects. When my father fell ill last year, I managed his care, scheduling the specialists and tracking his medications, while Natalie was too busy closing deals to visit. I kept the peace. I swallowed the slights. I paid the heavy emotional tax required to sit at their table, assuming that one day, my loyalty would yield a return on investment. Looking back, people might ask why I stayed silent for so long. Why did a successful, independent woman let her family treat her like a subordinate? The truth is, I was bound by the invisible chains of a lifetime of conditioning. Being raised alongside a golden child trained me to stay small and keep the peace to avoid conflict. But that night, the fear of death finally shattered the guilt that had kept me captive for decades. I wasn't weak. I was operating under the exact survival conditioning I had been taught since childhood. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid a tantrum, I was reinforcing the invisible bars of my own cage. I had believed that endurance was a form of strength, a badge of honor that proved my dedication to the family unit. But enduring abuse isn't strength. It's a slow surrender. It is a systematic dismantling of your own boundaries until you have nothing left to defend. Sitting in my living room, the residual chill of the tainted wine still lingering in my mind, those chains finally snapped. The conditioning evaporated in the face of raw, undeniable malice. I realized that my silence hadn't protected me. It had emboldened her. I looked at Michael, who was already running background checks on the catering staff. "I need my laptop," I said, my voice steady. The transition from victim to adversary was instantaneous. I recognized that the love I had been fighting for was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. Natalie had never viewed me as a sister. I was merely an obstacle occupying space she believed belonged to her. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my bridesmaid dress, feeling the heavy velvet like armor. The era of my passive endurance was officially over. I didn't cry, I didn't ask why. I just opened my laptop and started typing. At 11:51 at night, while Natalie and Brian were likely cutting their 4-tier wedding cake and posing for photographs, I initiated a full audit of my life. I had been named the executor of our father's estate when he passed away 2 months ago, a role Natalie had furiously contested but ultimately lost. Until tonight, I had handled the probate process with absolute fairness, ensuring every asset was perfectly appraised and legally protected. I drafted a high-priority email to my legal team. The subject line was not a plea for help, it was a directive. I instructed my attorneys to file an emergency motion for a restraining order on all shared trust assets. Within hours, the bank received a court-mandated freeze pending a formal fraud investigation. As the designated executor of our father's estate, I presented the initial evidence of misappropriation to the bank's fraud department. Given the urgent nature of the findings, they granted a temporary hold on the accounts pending further investigation. By 12:03 in the morning, the retaliatory framework was locked in. I was no longer a grieving daughter or a betrayed sister. I was a strategist, and my mind was entirely focused on the structural integrity of Natalie's financial ruin. Within 48 hours, my forensic accountants delivered their preliminary findings. The numbers told a story of staggering, methodical greed. Natalie hadn't just been waiting for her half of the estate. She had already begun siphoning it. The audit revealed an illicit 80-20 split. She had quietly transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore holding companies registered under Brian's name. She had bled the family accounts dry, assuming I would be too accommodating, too grieving, or too dead to notice the missing capital. I tracked every wire transfer, every forged signature, every hidden shell company. I scrutinized the balance sheets with the same intensity I applied to structural load calculations. My affection for my sister had been a subscription, and I had been footing the bill for 30 years. Now, that subscription was canceled. They weren't dealing with a victim who would cower and ask for an explanation. They were dealing with an architect. I instructed my accountants to cross-reference Brian's commercial real estate acquisitions over the past 60 days. As expected, the down payments for his latest luxury developments matched the exact amounts siphoned from my father's liquidation funds. They had used my inheritance to finance their marital empire. It was a breathtaking level of arrogance, rooted in the belief that I would never dare look behind the curtain. I documented every fraudulent transaction, compiling a dossier that was entirely bulletproof. My sister had tried to end my life over a portfolio of real estate and mutual funds. She had reduced my existence to a mathematical inconvenience. I was simply returning the favor, preparing to collect every single cent with punitive interest. I prepared the legal injunctions, ensuring that the moment she returned from her honeymoon, she would step into a financial vacuum. The financial theft was massive, but the true depth of Natalie's depravity didn't surface until 4 days later. I was sitting in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of my lawyer's downtown office. My lead counsel, David, slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked grim. "She didn't just steal the money, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "She rigged the entire game." I opened the file. Inside were medical records I had never seen before. They belonged to our late father, dated just 3 weeks before his death. The documents detailed severe cognitive decline, dementia, and a complete inability to manage his own affairs. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was my father's primary care physician, a man our family had trusted implicitly for over a decade. These are forged, I stated coldly, scanning the fabricated symptoms. My father was sharp until the very last day. He negotiated a commercial lease the week he died. David nodded, tapping the file. We pulled the doctor's bank records. Natalie wired him $75,000 through one of Brian's shell companies the exact day after this evaluation was supposedly conducted. She bribed him to fabricate a diagnosis of mental unfitness. The blueprint of her entire operation unrolled in my mind with terrifying clarity. The tainted wine at the wedding wasn't just a hateful impulse or a dramatic outburst. It was the final, critical step in a heavily premeditated corporate takeover. If I had consumed that wine and suffered a fatal or incapacitating medical emergency, Natalie would have immediately filed these forged psychiatric records. She would have contested the original will, claimed our father was not of sound mind when he named me executor, and used my sudden accident as the perfect window to seize total, uncontested control of the estate. She had engineered my death to expedite a hostile takeover. She wasn't just a greedy sibling stealing from the cookie jar. She was a calculating criminal orchestrating a multi-layered fraud. My pulse didn't quicken. My hands didn't shake. The revelation only crystallized my absolute focus. I wasn't emotionless. I was in a state of high alert survival, where grief was a luxury I simply couldn't afford until the threat was dismantled. The sheer audacity of her plan erased whatever lingering familial hesitation I might have harbored. I instructed David to hand the bribery evidence and the forged medical records directly to the district attorney. We bypassed civil litigation entirely. I don't want a settlement, I told David, sliding the folder back across the table. I want her in handcuffs. Prepare the documentation for the fraud division. The family dispute was officially over. The criminal prosecution had begun, and I was going to ensure she faced the maximum statutory penalties. Michael was waiting for me in the lobby. I handed him a copy of the dossier. We have the medical fraud, I confirmed. He scanned the pages, a cold smile forming on his lips. She left a digital trail a mile wide. Amateurs always do. I nodded. Natalie had relied on my perpetual silence to cover her tracks. She had grossly miscalculated the structural integrity of my resolve. She thought she was the master developer, but she was about to face the ultimate demolition. My private investigator had tracked their flight itinerary for weeks. When they landed and headed straight to my house, likely to demand more assets, I was ready. The fraud division had been monitoring their movements for days based on the preliminary evidence. Natalie arrived at my house on a Tuesday afternoon, fresh off her honeymoon in the Maldives. She stepped out of her luxury SUV wearing designer sunglasses, a glowing tan, and a practiced expression of sisterly concern. She expected to find me bedridden, desperately ill from the tainted wine, or completely shattered. She expected a victim ready to be manipulated and stripped of her remaining assets. Instead, she found me standing on my front porch, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer. Michael stood to my right, his posture relaxed but commanding. Behind me, positioned discreetly in my driveway, were 2 uniformed police officers and a detective from the fraud division. Their presence was necessitated not just by the financial crimes, but by the credible evidence of the attempted poisoning, which elevated this from a white-collar investigation to a critical matter of public safety. Natalie froze on the walkway, her designer heels sinking slightly into the manicured lawn. "Evelyn," she stammered, her fake concern instantly evaporating into genuine panic as her eyes darted to the uniforms. "What is this? Are you okay?" I didn't raise my voice. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete, and handed her a crisp legal document. I handed her a court-ordered injunction. Based on the proof that the office building was purchased with stolen estate funds, a judge had officially placed the property under receivership, effectively stripping your control over the premises. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling so violently the pages rustled. "You can't do this. I own that building. Brian and I own that property." "You bought that building using funds siphoned from our father's estate," I corrected her, my tone devoid of any emotion. "The forensic audit is complete. The district attorney has the wire transfers, the offshore account details, and the bank records of the physician you bribed to forge Dad's medical history. Your assets are frozen. Your accounts are seized." You own absolutely nothing." I watched her crumble, and in that moment, I witnessed the illusion of power in the empty wallet. We are conditioned to believe that wealthy, arrogant people possess an inherent strength. We mistake their designer clothes, their luxury vehicles, and their aggressive demands for actual power. But this is a profound psychological illusion. Their authority is entirely leased. It is a superficial armor purchased with money. The second that capital is stripped away, you realize there is no substance underneath. Natalie had no core character, no resilience, and no true power. Without her stolen bank accounts and her fraudulently acquired real estate, she was instantly reduced to a terrified, hollow shell. She wasn't a mastermind. She was just a bankrupt fraud standing on my lawn. The detective stepped forward, reading Natalie and Brian their Miranda rights. Through the front window, I watched as Brian tried to argue with the detective, only to be firmly guided toward the back of the patrol car. Natalie was weeping, a loud, ugly sound that would have once triggered my instinct to comfort her. Today, it was just background noise. They weren't shocked by the severity of what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. As the officers moved in to place her in handcuffs, Natalie looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for sisterly mercy. I felt nothing. I turned my back and walked inside my house, closing the door with a quiet, decisive click. The transaction was complete, and the account was finally settled. Justice was swift and utterly devoid of sentimentality. Natalie and Brian were indicted on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, forgery, and attempted manslaughter. The trial was a short, clinical dismantling of their lives. Faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence and the devastating testimony of the bribed physician, who immediately flipped to save himself, they accepted a plea deal. Due to the severity of the attempted manslaughter charges, combined with the federal wire fraud counts, the prosecution secured a significant sentence. Natalie was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, while Brian received 8. I attended the sentencing hearing not to gloat, but to finalize the ledger. When the judge handed down the verdict, Natalie looked at me from the defense table, perhaps expecting to see a sister's pity or a glimmer of the old Evelyn who used to clean up her messes. She saw nothing but a blank slate. I walked out of the courtroom, stepped into the bright afternoon sun, and never looked back. With the estate fully recovered and legally secured, I redirected my energy back to where it belonged, my architecture firm. I sold the old family properties, liquidating the remaining toxic assets, and used the capital to buy a massive, sunlit warehouse in the Arts District. I redesigned it from the ground up, turning it into a thriving, innovative workspace for my growing team. Michael, who had been my steady anchor through the entire storm, became a permanent fixture in my life. We built a relationship on mutual respect, trust, and absolute transparency. There were no hidden agendas, no forged documents, and no power plays. Just two people building a solid foundation together. We recently finalized the blueprints for a community center, a project funded entirely by the reclaimed assets from my father's estate. It felt like the ultimate architectural triumph, taking the capital that was meant to fund greed and corruption and reallocating it to build something that would actually serve people. It was my way of overwriting Natalie's legacy of destruction with a legacy of creation. Every beam we raised, every pane of glass we installed, felt like a structural reinforcement of my own renewed autonomy. I've come to realize that the concept of family is often used as a weapon, a blunt instrument designed to force compliance and demand endless sacrifice. We are taught that blood is an unbreakable bond, a sacred contract that must be honored regardless of the cost to our own sanity or safety. We are told to forgive the unforgivable simply because we share a last name. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. And in my case, true forgiveness meant forgiving myself for staying silent for so long. It meant understanding that I had no obligation to set myself on fire just to keep my sister warm. It meant releasing the guilt of finally holding my abuser accountable. Society loves to romanticize reconciliation. We are pressured to find common ground with those who hurt us, to sweep the ashes of our trauma under the rug for the sake of a holiday dinner. But I chose reality over romance. I chose my own survival over a toxic biological obligation. I learned that love is not a biological default. It is an action. It is the conscious daily choice to protect, uplift, and respect the people in your life. The family I have now, Michael, my friends, my dedicated colleagues, is a family I chose. We built our bonds not on shared DNA, but on shared values. My life is no longer a monument to endurance. It is a testament to peace. I cleared the wreckage of my past, poured a completely new foundation, and finally built a life where I am safe, respected, and entirely free. If this story gave you the courage to set a boundary you've been avoiding, share this video to help someone else. And don't forget to subscribe for more lessons in strength. What would you have done in Evelyn's shoes?